Hey guys. Tonight we are going on a journey to a place where the line between the earth and the sky feels a bit blurred, and where history isn't something you just read in a dusty book, but something you actually have to smear onto a wall with your bare hands. We re-heading to the heart of Mali, to the ancient city of Djenné, to help repair the world's largest mud brick building. It is a task that is part construction, part religious festival, and part absolute chaotic mud fight. Just a fair warning. If you were actually there, you'd probably last about 20 minutes before the 110-degree heat and the smell of fermented mud made you reconsider all your life choices. But lucky for you, you were just listening to my voice. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, I love hearing from you while the rest of the world is quiet. Drop a comment and tell me which city you in and what time it is right now. Are you a night owl in New York or catching this over an early coffee in Tokyo? Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You wake up, and the first thing you realize is that the air doesn't just carry heat, it carries weight. You're relying on a thin mat in a room with walls so thick, they feel like they've been there since the dawn of time. Outside, the city of Djenné is beginning to stir. You step out of the doorway, and your boots, which felt like a good practical choice back home, immediately feel ridiculous. Everyone else is in light, flowing robes, and you already sweating through your shirt before the sun has even fully cleared the horizon. As you walk through the narrow, winding alleys, the ground beneath you is a fine, pale dust that coats everything. And then you turn a corner, and there it is, the great mosque of Djenné. It doesn't look like any mosque or any building you've ever seen. It looks like it grew out of the ground. It's a massive, majestic fortress of sun-baked earth, glowing with a deep ochre hue. It is, by all accounts, the largest mud brick structure in the world. A title that sounds impressive until you realize that mud and water are generally things that don't get along. You stand there, squinting against the rising glare, looking at the three massive minarets that tower over the plaza. They are topped with something strange, smooth, white spheres. You might think they decorative stones. But here's a little weird fact for you. Those are actually ostrich eggs. In this part of the world, ostrich eggs are symbols of purity and fertility, perched right at the highest points of the sanctuary. It's a bit of a surreal touch, seeing giant bird eggs crowning a building that looks like a sandcastle built by a god. But as you look closer, you see why we here. The walls aren't smooth. They scarred. The rainy season in Mali isn't long, but when it hits hard. The Saharan sky opens up, and the water tries its absolute best to melt the mosque back into the riverbed it came from. You see deep grooves where the water has carved paths down the sides of the minarets. Large chunks of the Arab pisage, or the outer layer of plaster, have fallen away, exposing the mud bricks beneath. If the people of Djenné didn't do something about it every year, this entire UNESCO World Heritage Site would eventually just become a very expensive puddle. You notice something else sticking out of the walls, hundreds of wooden beams called Tehran, poking out like the quills of a giant porcupine. You might think they just for decoration, or maybe some kind of ancient architectural flair. But they actually built-in scaffolding. In a few hours, you're going to see people hanging off those beams like acrobats. But for now, they just cast long, jagged shadows against the earth-toned walls. Now, here is where the history gets a little debated. Most textbooks will tell you the first mosque on this site was built in the 13th century by Sultan Kunburu after he converted to Islam. He literally demolished his palace to build it because he wanted his place of worship to be the most magnificent thing in the city. However, the building you are looking at right now is that 13th century original. It's a reconstruction from 1907, And this is where the academic world starts throwing metaphorical mud at each other. Historians have been arguing for decades about how authentic this version is. Some scholars argue that the 1907 rebuild, which happened while Mali was under French colonial rule, was heavily influenced by French ideas of what an exotic African mosque should look like. They claim the French forced a sort of symmetrical order onto the design that wasn't there before. On the other side of the aisle, local oral historians and many architects argue that the people of Jen have always been the masters of their own mud. They insist the current design is a faithful evolution of the Sudano-Sahelian style that has existed for nearly 1,000 years. It has a tension between colonial interference and cultural resilience. And honestly, as you stand there in the dust, you realize the truth is probably stuck somewhere in the middle, much like the mud we about to mix. You walk toward the center of the plaza, and the atmosphere changes. It no longer quiet. You hear the rhythmic thumping of feet and the sound of shouting. Large pits have been dug into the ground, and they are being filled with water from the nearby Bani River. You watch as men start shoveling massive amounts of earth into these pits. This isn't just any dirt. It's a specific type of clay, heavy soil gathered from the riverbanks. But it's not ready yet. This is the part that usually surprises the tourists. To make the mud strong enough to withstand the elements, it has to be cured. They mix in rice husks, straw, and sometimes even baobab fruit powder. But the secret ingredient, time. This mixture has to sit and ferment for weeks. As you walk past one of the older pits, the smell hits you. It's a pungent, sour, earthy aroma, a mix of wet dog, old hay, and something vaguely swampy. It has the smell of tradition, and as the locals will tell you, the worse it smells, the better it sticks. You see a group of young men standing knee-deep in one of these pits, treading the mud with their bare feet to get the consistency just right. They laughing, their skin glistening with sweat and gray-brown slime. You realize that in a moment, you're going to have to join them. You look down at your clean clothes and your practical boots, and you realize they don't stand a chance. The sun is higher now, turning the world into a palette of gold and dust. The drums are starting to beat somewhere in the distance, a low, steady pulse that matches the heartbeat of the city. Tomorrow is the day of the great plastering, the Cree Pissage. But today is the day of preparation. You reach out and touch the wall of the mosque. It's warm, almost like it has a pulse of its own. It feels solid, yet you know it. It's fragile. It's a mountain made of dust, held together by the will of a community. You take a deep breath, the dry air stinging your lungs slightly, and you step toward the mud pits. You're not just a spectator anymore. You're part of the cycle. The mosque is waiting, and the mud is fermenting, and the story of Genchun is about to be written on your skin. You stand there, neck tilted back, squinting at this massive earthen monolith, and you can help but think. This is basically a giant gingerbread house made of dirt. It's a bit of a miracle that it's still standing, isn't it? In a world where we build things out of steel, glass, and reinforced concrete, the idea of a 65-foot-tall skyscraper made of sun-dried mud seems like something out of a fantasy novel, or perhaps a very ambitious DIY project gone slightly off the rails. But for the people of Gentoo, this is a novelty. It's the literal soul of their city. You walk closer, reaching out to touch the surface. The texture is surprisingly smooth in some places and rough in others, like the skin of an ancient elephant. This is the Sudano-Sahelian style of architecture, and it's a masterclass in working with what you have. In this part of Africa, you don't have vast forests for timber or quarries for marble. What you have is the river and the earth. So, you make bricks. These bricks, called feri, are composed of mud and straw, shaped by hand, and left to bake in the relentless Saharan sun until they are as hard as stone, or at least hard enough. But here is the mainstream history lesson for you. The story of this site begins way back in the 13th century. Imagine a local ruler named Sultan Kunburu. He was the 26th ruler of Genteen, and when he converted to Islam, he wanted to make a statement. He didn't just build a mosque, he gave up his own palace, had it pulled down, and told the builders to turn the site into a house of worship. It was a move that cemented Jenne as a twin jewel to the more famous Timbuktu. While Timbuktu was the center of learning, Jenne was the center of trade. The place where the gold from the south met the salt from the north. The mosque was the heartbeat of that wealth. You wander around the side of the building, looking for a way in. The mosque sits on a raised plinth, a platform about 9 feet high. This is just to make it look imposing, though it definitely works. It's a practical defense against the Bani River. When the floods come, the plaza can turn into a lake, and without this mud pedestal, the mosque would quite literally melt from the bottom up. If you were to step inside, and you'd have to leave those dusty boots at the door, you'd find yourself in a forest of pillars. This is one of those cool, slightly obscure facts that people often miss. The prayer hall is supported by 90 massive rectangular pillars that take up almost as much space as the floor itself. Not an open, airy cathedral style. Dense, rhythmic, and incredibly cool. Even when it's 115 degrees outside, the interior of the mosque stays remarkably chilled. The thick mud walls act like a natural thermal battery, soaking up the heat during the day and releasing it slowly at night. As you look up at the ceiling, you see small holes covered by ceramic caps. These are the mosque's air conditioning. When the caps are removed, hot air rises out, and cool air is pulled in from the shaded courtyard. It's a genius piece of ancient engineering. But here's the thing, because it's all made of earth, it's constantly moving, breathing, and, unfortunately, eroding. Now, I mentioned earlier that historians love a good fight, and here is another layer of that academic spicy tea. While the 1907 version we see today is world famous, there was a middle mosque built in the 1830s by a radical leader named Seku Ahmadu. He hated the original mosque, the one Kunburu built, because he thought it was too grand and un-Islamic. He let the original fall into ruin, which, with a mud building, takes about 5 minutes of neglect, and built a much smaller, more austere version nearby. History books often frame the 1907 rebuilding as a restoration. But here's where the academic debate gets heated. Was it actually a restoration or a completely new invention? Some architectural historians argue that the 1907 builders, under the watchful eyes of the French colonial administration, took the idea of African architecture and cranked it up to 11 to satisfy European tastes for the exotic. They point out that the original 13th century mosque might have been much more horizontal and less pointy. Others argue that the builders were simply reclaiming their heritage and that the 3 minarets were always part of the local soul. We don't have photos from the 1200s, obviously. So we left piecing together the truth from old travelers, sketches and oral legends. You step back into the sunlight, and the sheer scale of it hits you again. It's not just a building, it's a living sculpture. And because it's a living thing, it needs to be fed. Not with food, but with more mud. You notice a group of elders sitting in the shade of the walls, watching the younger men prepare the pits. They are the Bari Tun, the Guild of Masons. These men are the keepers of the mud secrets. In Jenne, being a mason isn't just a job. It's a hereditary priesthood of sorts. They know exactly how much rice husk to add to the clay to give it tension, and they know exactly where the cracks will appear before they even happen. Think about that for a second. In our world, we build a skyscraper and hope it lasts 100 years without us touching it. In Jenne, they build a masterpiece, knowing it will start falling apart the moment they finish. There is something strangely beautiful about that. Isn't there? It forces you to stay connected to the building. You can just walk away and forget it. If you don't, love it. If you don't, touch it. If you don't, smear it with new earth every year. It disappears. It's a relationship, not just a structure. You look down at your hands. They still clean, but not for long. The air is getting thicker with the scent of the secret sauce, fermenting in the pits nearby. You realize that the mosque isn't just standing there waiting for a repair. It's waiting for a celebration. The mud cookie is about to get a fresh layer of icing, and you restarting to realize that you not just here to observe history. You here to hold it together. The drums in the distance are getting louder now, and the sun is beginning its slow descent, painting the walls of the mosque in shades of deep violet and burnt orange. You feel a strange sense of anticipation. It's as if the building itself is thirsty for the attention. It's about to receive. You restarting to understand that in Jen, the line between the people and the earth they live on isn't just thin. It's non-existent. You standing at the edge of one of the massive pits now, and the first thing you want to do is cover your nose. Remember how I mentioned the fermented smell? Well, up close. It's not just a scent, it's a physical presence. It's thick, sour, and carries a punch that makes your eyes water. You look at a local man nearby, who is calmly chewing on a piece of licorice root, seemingly unfazed, and you realize that to him, this smell doesn't mean rot, it means strength. This is the legendary crepissage mixture, the secret sauce that keeps the great mosque from melting into a puddle of brown sludge the moment a rain cloud looks at it funny. You might think, it's just mud, right? Dig a hole, add some water, slap it on the wall, and call it a day. If you tried that, your work would crack and fall off within a week. No, what you're looking at is a sophisticated piece of biological engineering. The mainstream historical fact here is that the base of this mixture is a very specific type of silty clay gathered from the banks of the Bani and Niger rivers. This clay is rich in minerals and has a natural plasticity that makes it perfect for construction, but the magic happens in the additives. You watch as workers toss in armfuls of rice husks and chopped straw. This isn't just filler, it acts like the rebar in modern concrete. The fibers create a microscopic web within the mud, giving it tensile strength so it can expand and contract in the brutal heat without shattering. And then comes the part that sounds like a medieval alchemist's recipe. They add baobab fruit powder, shea butter, and sometimes even a decoction made from boiled bark. But here is the truly weird, slightly fact that most guidebooks gloss over. The secret to the best mud is time and bacteria. They mix all these organic materials into the clay and then just let it sit for weeks. The organic matter, the straw, the fruit, the husks, begins to decompose. This fermentation process creates a gooey, protein-rich slime that binds the clay particles together on a molecular level. It turns the mud into something more like a polymer than a simple dirt mixture. It becomes creamy, sticky, and incredibly durable. In Gentine, if your mud doesn't smell like a swamp, as gym socks, it's simply not ready to be used. You step closer to the pit and a young man gestures for you to come in. You hesitate, looking at your shoes, but then you remember where you are. You kick them off, roll up your trousers, and take that first, squelchy step. The sensation is unexpected. It's cool, shockingly cool, compared to the 110-degree air, and it feels like walking through thick, heavy chocolate pudding. As you sink in up to your calves, you feel the grit of the sand and the prickle of the straw between your toes. It's strangely satisfying, in a toddler playing in the backyard kind of way, until you realize you recurrently standing in several tons of fermenting organic matter. As you begin to walk in circles, helping to knead the mud with your feet, you notice some of the master masons, the baryton, walking around the pits like elite chefs inspecting a soup. They dip a finger into the mud, rub it between their thumb and forefinger, and sometimes even give it a quick sniff. They are looking for a specific glide and a specific tackiness. This brings us to a point of massive scholarly debate that has the architectural world in a bit of a tizzy. For the last few decades, some modernizing voices have suggested that the people of Jen should add a little bit of Portland cement to the mixture to make it last longer and reduce the need for this exhausting annual labor. It sounds practical, right? Well, the traditionalists and many heritage scientists are horrified by the idea. The debate centers on breathability. Mud walls are porous, they breathe moisture out. Cement, however, creates a waterproof seal. Historians and engineers argue that if you put a layer of cement over a mud core, the moisture from the ground will get trapped inside the wall with nowhere to go. The mud would eventually turn into a liquid mush inside its own cement shell, causing the entire mosque to collapse from the inside out. There is actually a heated academic argument over whether some rogue repairs in the late 20th century secretly used cement, and some scholars claim they can see the scars of that mistake in the way certain sections of the wall are weathering. The consensus now among the Baryton is strictly no cement, but the pressure from modern builders to improve. The process never quite goes away. You continue to trudge through the mud, your legs starting to feel the weight. Every step requires a deliberate lift, a slop sound echoing against the nearby walls. You realize that this isn't just a chore, it's a physical connection to the earth. In the West, we buy our building materials from a big box store, wrapped in plastic and standardized to the millimeter. Here, you are literally making the building with your body. You are part of the chemical reaction that keeps the sanctuary standing. You look up from the pit and see the mosque towering above you. From this low angle, it looks even more like a living creature. A giant beast made of the same stuff that is currently coating your knees. You see the Toron beams sticking out, and you realize that tomorrow you'll be climbing those with handfuls of this stinky, glorious sludge. A kid nearby splashes a bit of mud toward you and laughs. You splash back, the dark gray goo landing on his shoulder. The tension of being a visitor starts to melt away. You are just another person in the pit, another set of legs helping to churn the mixture. The sun is hanging low now, turning the dust in the air into a shimmering haze of gold. The smell of the mud is still there, but your nose has started to tune it out. Or maybe you've just accepted it as the scent of the task at hand. The elders start to signal that the day's mixing is done. The pits will sit overnight. One last night of quiet fermentation before the chaos of the festival begins. You climb out of the pit, your legs looking like they've been dipped in dark chocolate. You try to wipe some of it off, but it's already starting to dry in the arid air, tightening against your skin, like a spa treatment you definitely didn't pay for. As you walk back toward your lodgings, leaving a trail of muddy footprints on the sun-baked street, you feel a deep, grounding exhaustion. You've spent the day preparing the flesh of the mosque. Tomorrow, you'll help give it its new skin. You look back one last time at the great structure, and it seems to have changed color in the twilight, turning a deep, bruised purple. It's waiting, and you, with your mud-caked toes and aching calves, are finally ready for it.
You're back at your lodgings, and let's be honest, trying to scrub that fermented mud off your skin is like trying to wash away a bad reputation. It lingers. No matter how much water you splash over your legs, that faint, earthy, sour scent stays with you. It's your new shadow. You're sitting on a rooftop terrace now, watching the sky turn from a bruised purple into a deep, velvety black. The heat has finally lost its teeth, replaced by a dry, gentle breeze that carries the sound of the city. Usually, a town of this size would be winding down, but Jen tonight feels like a coiled spring. There's a vibration in the air, a low-frequency buzz of anticipation. You can see small fires flickering in courtyards across the city. People are cooking massive pots of rice and mutton, fueling up for the physical marathon that starts in just a few hours. This is the eve of the crepusage, and if you think you're going to get a solid 8 hours of beauty sleep, you are hilariously mistaken. The main historical point you should know about this night is that it's not just a construction schedule, it's a social contract. The organization of the festival is handled by the Baryton, that guild of masons I mentioned earlier. But they aren't just builders, they are the conductors of an entire urban symphony. They divide the city into neighborhoods, and each neighborhood is responsible for a specific section of the mosque. It's a massive, friendly, but deadly serious competition. The south neighborhood doesn't want the north neighborhood to finish their wall first. To lose is to be the subject of friendly taunts for the next 364 days. This social structure has kept the mosque standing for centuries, turning a grueling chore into a point of intense civic pride. As you sit there, the first drum beats begin. They aren't the loud, crashing drums you might expect from a festival. They start as a low, rhythmic thumping, the tam-tams. It's a sound that feels like it's coming from the earth itself rather than an instrument. And here's a weird, slightly obscure fact for you, these drums aren't just making music, they are talking. In the Sahel, talking drums can mimic the pitch and rhythm of human speech. On the night before the plastering, the drummers are often reciting the lineages of the great masons of the past, calling out the names of families who have served the mosque for 700 years. It's like a rhythmic who's who of West African history, played out over the rooftops. You see silhouettes moving in the streets below. Groups of young men are gathered around the mud pits we worked in earlier, singing songs that sound ancient and gritty. They are guarding the mud. Why? Well, it's partially tradition, but it's also to keep the energy up. They stay awake all night. Let that sink in. These guys are about to perform one of the most physically demanding tasks on the planet, and their pre-game strategy is an all-night dance party fueled by tea and adrenaline. Now, this brings us to a juicy piece of academic controversy that keeps historians up at night. There is a long-standing debate about the true origins of this festival. On the surface, it's an Islamic event, it's the Great Mosque, after all. But many scholars argue that the crepusage is actually a baptized version of much older, pre-Islamic animist rituals. They point to the way the mud is treated almost like a living sacrifice, the specific songs sung, and the ostrich eggs on the minarets as evidence of an ancient African spirituality that refused to disappear when Islam arrived. Some historians claim the festival is a perfect example of syncretism, the blending of two worlds, while others insist it's a purely Islamic expression of community. Depending on which professor you ask, you'll get a very different story about why people are dancing around mud pits at midnight. You lean back against the cool mud brick parapet of the roof. The architecture around you is fascinating. In the moonlight, the houses of Jen look like melting wax. There are no sharp corners here, everything is rounded, organic, and soft. It's a city that feels like it was hand-molded rather than built. You notice the Moroccan-style windows and the Sudanese-style pillars, a reminder that this city was once the crossroads of a global trade network that stretched from the Mediterranean to the gold mines of the Deep South. Suddenly, a louder shout erupts from the plaza near the mosque. You look over and see torches being lit. The energy is shifting. It's no longer just anticipation, it's becoming action. You realize that in Jen, time doesn't move in a straight line, it moves in a circle. Every year, the rain washes the mosque away, and every year, the people put it back. It's a constant battle against gravity and the elements, a Sisyphean task that the city has somehow turned into the highlight of their year. You think about your own life for a second, the things we build to last forever, the stainless steel and the plastic that will outlive our great-grandchildren. There's something almost arrogant about our desire for permanence, isn't there? Here, they embrace the fact that their most sacred building is temporary. They accept that it needs them. If the people stopped showing up, the mosque would return to the earth in a decade. It's a fragile, beautiful codependency. The drums are getting faster now. The talking has turned into a call to arms. You check your watch, it's 2 a.m. You have maybe 2 hours before the official start. You consider trying to nap, but your heart is thumping in time with the tam-tams. You feel a strange surge of loyalty to that mud pit you were standing in earlier. You want to see that secret sauce you helped mix finally meet the walls. You stand up, stretch your aching calves, and decide to head down. You're not going to sleep. You're going to find some of that strong, bitter Malian tea, find a spot near the mosque, and wait for the sun. The air is cool, the city is singing, and the great mosque stands silent in the center of it all, a dark mountain waiting to be reborn. You're about to witness the moment when 1,000 people turn into a single machine, and honestly, a little bit of sleep deprivation is a small price to pay for a front-row seat to a miracle. As you descend the narrow, dark stairs of your guest house, you catch your reflection in a small mirror. You're dusty, you smell faintly of fermented rice husks, and your eyes are a little bloodshot. You look less like a tourist and a little more like a participant. And as the drums reach a crescendo outside, you realize that the story isn't something you're watching, it's something that's about to happen to you. It's 4 a.m. The air is at its coldest, which in Gen means it's finally dropped to a temperature that doesn't feel like a personal insult. You're standing in the great plaza, clutching a small glass of gunpowder tea that's so strong and sugary it's basically liquid lightning. You haven't slept, but honestly, neither has the rest of the city. The darkness is thick, but it's not quiet. You can hear the rustle of thousands of feet, the low murmur of voices, and that persistent, rhythmic drumming that hasn't stopped since yesterday. Then, it happens. A single, piercing whistle rips through the pre-dawn air. If you thought the Black Friday rush at a big box store was intense, you haven't seen anything yet. Suddenly, the shadows around you explode into motion. Hundreds of young men, the Junes, who were lounging against walls or sitting in silence moments ago, are now sprinting. They aren't running away from something, they are running toward the mud pits. This is the official start of the crepusage, and the energy is so electric it practically makes the hair on your arms stand up. You're swept up in the crowd. It's a literal mud dash. You're running through the dark, your feet kicking up clouds of fine Saharan dust, trying to keep pace with guys who have been doing this since they could walk. The goal is simple: be the first to reach your neighborhood's assigned pit and get that first basket of mud moving. There's no prize money, no trophy, just the sheer, unadulterated glory of being the fastest and the strongest in the eyes of the city. The mainstream historical fact you need to understand here is the role of the Bariton, the Masons Guild, in this chaos. While it looks like a free-for-all, it is actually a highly orchestrated operation. Every inch of the mosque's walls is divided among the city's various quarters or neighborhoods. Each quarter has its own designated mud pits and its own team of laborers. The Bariton act as the supreme commanders, standing on the high plinths of the mosque, overseeing the madness to ensure that the competition doesn't turn into a literal riot. They are the keepers of the architectural peace. As you reach the edge of the pit you worked on yesterday, you see the first wave of runners dive in. They don't just step in, they launch themselves. Within seconds, the pit is a churning sea of limbs and gray-brown sludge. This leads us to a weirdly specific, almost eccentric fact: the first mud of the day is often treated as if it were spiritually charged. In some local traditions, the very first bucket pulled from the pit after the whistle blows is believed to carry the baraka, or blessing, of the ancestors. The person who carries it is considered the luckiest soul in Gen for that day, though luck, in this context usually just means you're the one covered in the most fermented mud. You find yourself standing on the edge of the chaos, unsure where to jump in. The sky is just starting to turn a pale, ghostly gray, revealing the silhouettes of the boys and men. They are filling wicker baskets with the fermented mud at a speed that seems physically impossible. They hoist these heavy, dripping baskets onto their heads or shoulders and begin a frantic relay back to the mosque walls. Now, this frantic pace is the subject of a very specific academic debate among architectural historians and conservationists. Many Western experts look at this 4 a.m. mud sprint and shake their heads in disapproval. They argue that the speed of the crepusage is detrimental to the building's health. They claim that because the mud is applied so quickly and under such chaotic conditions, it doesn't always bond perfectly with the layer beneath it, leading to air pockets and future erosion. Some scholars have even suggested that the people of Jen should adopt a slower, more methodical approach to restoration, essentially suggesting they turn a vibrant, living festival into a quiet, professional construction site. The local response to this? A polite, but firm, "You don't understand how our world works." To the people of Jen and many Africanist scholars, the speed is the point. The chaos is actually a highly efficient form of ritualized labor that ensures the entire building is plastered in a single day. If they did it slowly, the mud would dry at different rates, causing the very cracks the Western experts are worried about. It's a clash of philosophies, the Western museum approach versus the African living monument approach. As you watch a teenager sprint past you with 20 pounds of mud on his head, laughing as he dodges a stray dog, you tend to side with the locals. This building isn't a museum piece, it's a member of the family. The sun finally begins to peek over the horizon, and the scene is transformed. The gray silhouettes turn into vibrant, mud-slicked figures. The mosque itself looks different in this light. It's no longer just a building, it's a hive. You see the first baskets reaching the base of the walls. There, the human chain begins to form. This is where you come in. You're gestured toward a line of men stretching from the pit to the foot of the Great South Wall. You take your place in the line. The person to your left is a man in his 60s, his muscles like gnarled wood. The person to your right is a boy who can't be more than 12. The first basket arrives. It's heavy, heavier than you expected, and it's dripping that sour-smelling slime all over your arms. You pass it to the right. Then the next one comes. And the next. The rhythm starts to take over. Your heart rate is up, your muscles are waking up with a jolt of adrenaline, and the sleep you didn't get is a distant memory. The smell of the mud is now everywhere, it's on your hands, your clothes, and probably on your face. But as the sun hits the top of the minarets, turning them into glowing pillars of fire, you realize you're part of a 100-meter dash that has been running for nearly 800 years. You look toward the mosque and see the first handfuls of mud being slapped onto the wall. The sound, a wet, percussive thwack, echoes across the plaza. It's the sound of a promise being kept. The mud dash is over, but the real work, the artistic, messy, glorious work of the crepissage, is just beginning. You tighten your grip on the next basket, feel the grit of the river silt against your palms, and prepare yourself. This isn't a sprint anymore. It's a dance. The sun is no longer just peaking, it's officially decided to join the party, and it brought its signature Saharan blowtorch with it. You're standing in the middle of a human chain that stretches from the mud pits all the way to the towering base of the mosque. To your left is a teenager who seems to have more energy than a nuclear reactor, and to your right is a man whose face is a roadmap of every crepissage since the 1970s. You are a single link in a living, breathing conveyor belt, and the first basket of mud has just landed in your hands with a wet, heavy thud. Let's talk about these baskets for a second, because they are a marvel of low-tech engineering. They are hand-woven from stiff river reeds, designed to be just porous enough to let the excess water drain out so the mud stays thick, but tight enough that you don't lose half the payload on your neighbor's feet. However, just porous enough means that as you lift the basket, a stream of fermented mud juice, remember that lovely scent, runs straight down your arms and into your armpits. It's a sensory experience you won't find in any luxury spa brochure, I promise. The rhythm is incredible. It's not a slow, leisurely handoff. It's a rhythmic, swinging motion. Catch, pivot, release. Catch, pivot, release. Your shoulders are already starting to burn, and you've only been at it for 20 minutes. You try to keep your eyes on the basket, but it's hard not to look up at the mosque. From this close, the building doesn't look like a landmark, it looks like a hungry mountain. Thousands of baskets are flowing toward it from all directions, and the walls are literally swallowing them up. Here is a mainstream historical fact to keep your mind off your aching biceps. this relay system is the backbone of Gen's social structure. The city is divided into several quarters or neighborhoods, such as Kanofia or Yabutakia. Each quarter is fiercely protective of its assigned section of the mosque. Historians note that this isn't just about labor, it's about a deeply ingrained sense of taguna, or community responsibility. If your neighborhood section looks crumbly or thin by the end of the day, it's a mark of shame that lasts until next year. The relay isn't just moving mud, it's moving the reputation of your entire family. You're starting to find the zone. The sound of the drums from the plaza has blended with the rhythmic chanting of the men in your line. They are singing mud songs, which are essentially rhythmic metronomes. One guy leads with a call, usually a joke about someone's strength or a shout of encouragement, and the rest of the line bellows back a response as they swing the baskets. If you stop moving, the rhythm breaks, and you become the bottleneck in a very muddy, very high-stakes assembly line. Now, for a weird little fact that you won't find in the standard Visit Mali pamphlets, the mud in your hands is technically alive. Because of that fermentation process we talked about earlier, the mud is teeming with specific bacteria that help produce the lactic acid and polymers that make the plaster stick. In some parts of the region, it's a whispered tradition that a truly great mason can hear if the mud is ready by the sound it makes when it hits the basket. If it sounds too splashy, it needs more straw. If it sounds too dull, it needs more water. You, however, just think it sounds like someone dropping a wet steak onto a marble floor over and over again. As the morning wears on, the pace actually increases. You'd think people would get tired, but the competitive energy is infectious. You see the baryton, the master masons, standing on the high plinths above you. They are gesturing, shouting directions, and occasionally catching a basket themselves to show the youngsters how it's done. This leads us to a fascinating point of academic controversy that has been simmering in the world of architectural conservation for decades. Scholars from the Aga Khan Trust for Culture and various Western universities have often debated whether this chaotic, communal relay should be professionalized. In the late 20th century, there was a push to bring in modern scaffolding, standardized mortar mixes, and professional construction crews to ensure a more scientific preservation of the mosque. Some historians argued that the traditional relay was too inconsistent and that the human element led to structural weaknesses. However, this sparked a massive backlash from local leaders and anthropologists. They argued that the imperfections of the human relay are exactly what give the mosque its soul. They pointed out that the communal labor is the monument. If you replace the people with a professional crew, the mosque ceases to be a living sanctuary and becomes a dead museum piece. This conflict of conservation is still taught in architecture schools today. Do you preserve the bricks, or do you preserve the culture that makes the bricks? In Gen, the culture won. They stuck with the messy, sweaty, glorious human conveyor belt, and looking at the sheer joy on the faces of the men around you, it's hard to argue they made the wrong choice. Your hands are now so slick with mud that catching the basket has become a game of high-stakes slip and slide. You have to grip the reeds with your fingertips, feeling the rough texture through the slime. You notice that the person to your right has started a game, trying to pass the basket without looking, relying entirely on the feel of the weight shifting. You try it once, nearly drop the basket on your own toes, and decide to stick to the looking method for now. The heat is really starting to cook. The dust kicked up by the thousands of running feet has created a golden haze that hangs over the plaza, making everything look like an old, sepia-toned photograph. Your skin is a patchwork of dried gray mud and fresh, wet brown streaks. You look at your arms and realize you can't tell where you end and the mosque begins. You are literally becoming part of the building's new skin. A basket comes through that's particularly heavy. It must be mostly clay with very little straw. You grunt as you heave it toward the next guy, and he gives you a wide, toothy grin and a nod of respect. You've been accepted. You're not just the visitor anymore, you're the guy at position 42 who hasn't dropped a basket yet. The line shifts suddenly. The baskets are being redirected toward a different part of the wall. The lower levels are almost filled, and the work is moving upward. You look up and see people starting to scale the sides of the mosque, and you realize the ground level part of your job is coming to an end. The mud needs to go higher. It needs to reach the towers. And you're starting to wonder, as you wipe a glob of mud off your forehead, exactly how they plan to get 10 tons of fermented sludge 60 feet into the air without a single crane in sight. You look up from the muddy chaos of the plaza, and for the first time, you really focus on the spikes. You know the ones, those hundreds of wooden beams poking out of the mosque's walls like the quills of an angry, oversized porcupine. Earlier, they looked like a strange decorative choice, maybe a bit of avant-garde flair from the 13th century. But now, as the ground-level walls are thick with fresh plaster, the rhythm of the festival shifts. The mud needs to go up. Way up. And you realize those wooden beams are not just for show, they are the most important furniture in the city. In the world of architecture, these are called toran. They are the permanent scaffolding of the Sudano-Sahelian style. Most buildings in the world require a construction crew to come in, set up expensive metal poles, and then take them down when the job is done. But here, the scaffolding is part of the building's DNA. It's a brilliant, low-tech solution to a high-altitude problem. Without these beams, the Great Mosque would be a smooth, untouchable mountain. With them, it becomes a giant jungle gym. You watch as a group of young men, some no older than 15, start to scale the walls. They don't have harnesses. They don't have helmets. They have bare feet, calloused hands, and a complete lack of a sense of self-preservation. They leap from the ground onto the first row of toran, then pull themselves up to the next. They look like acrobats, or perhaps mountain goats that have somehow evolved to live on mud. They balance on these narrow wooden sticks, 60 feet above the ground, while reaching down to catch dripping baskets of mud tossed up from the human chains below. Here's a mainstream historical fact for you to chew on while you worry about their safety. The toran are made from the Boryssus ethiopium, more commonly known as the Palmyra palm. This isn't just any wood. In a region where termites treat most timber like an all-you-can-eat buffet, the Palmyra palm is the ultimate defense. It is incredibly dense, heavy, and naturally resistant to rot and insect damage. Historians have noted that even when a mud building in this region is completely abandoned and melts away into a pile of dirt after decades of rain, the toran beams are often found still standing, perfectly preserved amidst the ruins. They are the bones that outlast the flesh. A mason gestures to you. He's standing on a ledge about 10 feet up, and he wants you to join the climbing relay. You look at your hands, they are currently gloved in a thick layer of slick, gray slime. You look at the wooden beams, they are also covered in mud. This seems like a recipe for a very short, very painful trip to the hospital, but the energy of the crowd won't let you say no. You grab the first beam. It's solid, rough, and surprisingly grippy despite the mud. You pull yourself up, your muscles screaming in a way they haven't since high school gym class. As you hang there, midway between the earth and the towers, you find yourself face to face with a piece of wood that might be older than your grandparents. This brings us to a fascinating academic controversy that keeps architectural historians arguing over their afternoon tea. While everyone agrees the toran are functional, there is a deep debate about their symbolic origin. Some Western scholars argue that the toran are a purely practical evolution, a response to the lack of other scaffolding materials in the Sahel. However, many Africanist historians and local elders suggest something much deeper. They point out that in many traditional West African belief systems, the protruding stick is a common feature in ancestral shrines, representing a bridge between the physical and spiritual worlds. Some argue the mosque is designed to look like a living body, and the toran represent the ribs or the hair of a spirit. There's a heated scholarly tug-of-war over whether we should view these beams as engineering tools or spiritual lightning rods. Did the function create the form, or did an ancient spiritual aesthetic just happen to be really useful for plastering? The answer is likely buried under 7 centuries of mud. You manage to hoist yourself onto a slightly wider ledge, your heart hammering against your ribs. From up here, the view is dizzying. You can see the entire city of Jen, a sea of flat-roofed mud houses, all huddled together as if for warmth. You see the Bonny River shimmering in the distance, the source of all this clay. And below you, the plaza is a swirling kaleidoscope of brown, gray, and white. The drums sound different from up here, the rhythm feels like it's vibrating through the wall itself and into your very bones. Someone shouts from above. A basket is being swung up. You have to reach out, balance on one foot, and catch it. The weight of the mud nearly pulls you off your perch, but a hand reaches out from the shadows and steadies you. It's one of the master masons. He doesn't say a word, he just gives you a wink and takes the basket, dipping his hand into the mud and slapping it onto a crack with the precision of a master painter. Here is a weird, slightly eccentric fact for you. The Torin also serve as a primitive, alarm system, for the mosque's structural health. Because they are embedded deep into the core of the walls, they move as the building settles. A master mason can look at the angle of the Torin and tell if the wall is leaning or if there's a hidden pocket of moisture deep inside the masonry. They can read the sticks like a doctor reads a pulse. To you, it's a precarious ladder, to them, it's a diagnostic dashboard. You spend the next hour in a daze of vertical labor. Catch a basket, pass it up. Grab a handful of mud, fill a hole, smooth it over. The sun is beating down on your back, and the reflection of the heat off the mud walls is intense. You're sweating so much that the mud on your face is starting to run into your mouth. It tastes like salt, river silt, and history. It's not a flavor I'd recommend for a Michelin-starred meal, but in this moment, it tastes like belonging. You look up at the minarets, where the ostrich eggs sit calmly against the blue sky. You are still 30 feet below them, but you feel like you've climbed a mountain. The Torin are your only connection to safety, these ancient, termite-proof limbs that have held up generations of men just like you. You realize that the mosque isn't just a building you are fixing, it's a living thing you are climbing on, a giant that allows you to crawl over its skin as long as you promise to keep it beautiful. As you prepare to climb even higher toward the Section 8 of this journey, you take a moment to just hang there, suspended between the dust and the heavens. Your fear of heights hasn't disappeared, but it's been muffled by the sheer, repetitive rhythm of the work. You grip the Palmyra palm, feel the pulse of the city below, and realize that as long as these spikes stay in the wall, the heart of Jen will keep beating. That you're still perched on that wooden beam, your legs shaking just a little bit from the effort of staying upright, but your eyes are drawn downward. Away from the towering minarets and back toward the ground where the real, messy magic is happening. From up here, the mud pits look like giant, boiling pots of dark chocolate, but they aren't boiling from heat, they are boiling with life. Specifically, they are swarming with children. If you were a helicopter parent from a modern suburb, you'd probably be having a collective heart attack right about now. There are hundreds of boys, some as young as 5 or 6, completely submerged in the mud pits. They aren't just playing in the mud, they are the mud. They are covered from head to toe in that thick, gray-brown sludge, their eyes and teeth flashing white against their darkened skin as they laugh and scream. To an outsider, it looks like a playground accident of epic proportions. But look closer, and you'll see that these kids are actually the most efficient part of the entire operation. This brings us to a mainstream historical point about West African social structures, the concept of informal apprenticeship. In Jen, you don't go to a trade school to learn how to be a mason, you grow up in the mud. These children are the future baryton. By being in the pits, they are learning the feel of the material. They are learning the exact moment the mud transitions from too watery to perfectly plastic. They are absorbing centuries of architectural knowledge through their pores before they even learn to read or write. It's a multi-generational classroom where the textbook is the earth itself. You watch one kid, he can't be more than 7, who is currently doing a literal backflip into the center of a pit. You might think he's just being a troublemaker, but his constant movement is actually vital. Here's a weird, slightly gross, but undeniably practical fact: the children act as human blenders. To keep the fermented mud at the right consistency, it has to be constantly agitated. If it sits still, the heavy silt settles to the bottom and the water rises to the top, ruining the mix. The kids, by wrestling, racing, and sliding through the pits, are ensuring the straw, the rice husks, and the fermented, secret sauce stay perfectly suspended. They are literally playing the mosque into existence. As you watch them, you notice something else. Despite the blistering sun, these kids don't seem to be burning. And here is your obscure fact for the night: the mud itself acts as a high SPF, all-natural sunscreen and insect repellent. The thick layer of clay and minerals creates a physical barrier against the UV rays, and the pungent smell of the fermented organic matter is basically keep away spray for the local mosquito population. In a place where the sun is a constant predator, being covered in mud is the ultimate survival strategy. It's a Gen Spa treatment that actually works, even if it doesn't smell like lavender. But, as with everything in this ancient city, there is a cloud of academic controversy hovering over these muddy children. If you scroll through the reports of certain international human rights organizations or Western NGOs, you'll find some very stern language about child labor at the Great Mosque. There is a persistent debate in the halls of academia between universalist human rights advocates and cultural relativists. One side argues that having children perform heavy physical labor in a construction site is a violation of international standards and that the kids should be in a traditional classroom instead. The other side, mostly comprised of anthropologists and local leaders, argues that this is a fundamental misunderstanding of Malian culture. They contend that the crepusage is a rite of passage and a form of community bonding that can't be replaced by a chalkboard. They argue that excluding the children would be a form of cultural erasure, breaking the chain of knowledge that has kept the mosque standing since the 1200s. It's a heavy, complicated debate that feels very far away when you're watching a 10-year-old challenge his friend to a mud wrestling match while simultaneously filling a basket for his father. You decide it's time to head back down to earth. You descend the Toran beams, your movements a bit more confident now, and as your feet hit the dusty ground, you're immediately swarmed by a group of these mud monsters. They aren't asking for money or candy, they want you to join the sliding lane. They've cleared a path of particularly slick mud leading from one pit to another, and they are using it as a slip and slide. You hesitate for a second. You're an adult. You're a visitor. You're supposed to be observing history. But then you look at the mosque, which is essentially just a giant, sacred mud pie, and you realize that seriousness is not what this building wants from you. It wants your energy. You take a running start, hit the mud lane, and slide for about 10 feet before wiping out in a spectacular cloud of gray spray. The kids erupt in cheers. One of them helps you up, leaving a perfect muddy handprint on your chest. You realize that your cool, detached observer persona is officially dead and buried under 3 inches of silt. And honestly, it feels great. The mud is cool against your skin, and the sheer, unbridled joy of the children is infectious. You start to understand that the mosque isn't just a religious site, it's a living, breathing member of the community. It's the grandparent that everyone comes to take care of once a year, and the children are the grandchildren who bring the house back to life with their noise and chaos. As the morning progresses, you see the master masons, the older men who usually look so stern, occasionally cracking a smile as they watch the kids. They might bark an order to stay focused, but they don't stop the play. They know that in 10 years, that kid doing the backflip will be the one standing on the high minaret, and in 30 years, he'll be the one deciding which riverbank has the best clay. The sun is now directly overhead, and the heat is becoming a physical weight again. The kids are finally starting to slow down, some of them climbing out of the pits to sit in the shade of a nearby mud wall, their skin drying into a pale, cracked, statue look. You sit with them for a moment, catching your breath. Your ears are ringing with the sound of the drums and the shouting, but here, in the shadow of the wall, there's a strange, muddy peace. You look at your hands, which are now indistinguishable from the earth beneath you. You've spent the morning as a human blender, and you realize that the story of the Great Mosque isn't just about sultans, colonialists, or architects. It's about the fact that every single person in this city, from the oldest sage to the smallest toddler, has their DNA literally mixed into the walls. The mosque isn't just in Jen, it is Jen. And as long as there are kids willing to jump into a stinky pit of fermented mud, this mountain of earth isn't going anywhere. You stand up, shaking off a bit of dried mud, and look toward the river. You see a line of women approaching, carrying heavy clay jars on their heads. They are moving with a grace that seems impossible in this heat, and you realize the next chapter of the day is about to begin. The mud needs more than just feet to mix it, it needs water. And in Jen, the water has its own set of queens. You're standing in the shade of a low mud brick wall, trying to wipe a layer of dust from your eyelashes, when you see them. It's like a vibrant, moving rainbow cutting through the monotonous brown and gray of the plaza. A long, graceful line of women is approaching from the direction of the Bani River. They aren't covered in mud, at least not yet, and they aren't sprinting like the young men. Instead, they move with a steady, rhythmic gait that makes the heavy plastic buckets and traditional clay jars balanced on their heads look like they weigh nothing at all. Welcome to the Water Brigade. If the young men are the muscle of this operation and the children are the blenders, the women of Jen are the literal lifeblood. Without them, this whole festival would grind to a halt in about 20 minutes. You see, the Sahara has a way of sucking the moisture out of everything. That carefully fermented mud we've been talking about. If it isn't constantly hydrated, it turns into a pile of useless, cracked dirt. You watch as the first group of women reaches the mud pits. They don't just dump the water and leave. There's a specific technique to it, a flick of the neck and a steady pour that ensures the water is distributed evenly. As the water hits the dry dust, that familiar, petrichor, smell, the scent of rain on dry earth, rises up, momentarily masking the sour funk of the fermentation. It's a brief, refreshing moment in an otherwise punishingly hot day. Here is a mainstream historical fact that puts this into perspective. For centuries, the Great Mosque and the city of Jen have existed in a delicate, symbiotic dance with the Bani River. The river provides the clay, the river provides the water, and the river provides the transport for the trade that paid for the building in the first place. Historically, the water walk was an essential part of the city's daily rhythm, not just during the festival. Before modern wells were dug, every drop of water for every house in the city followed this exact path from the riverbank on the heads of the women. The crepusage is essentially a giant, ceremonial encore of that ancient daily chore. You step aside as a woman in a brilliant emerald green wrap passes you. This leads us to an absolutely fascinating, slightly obscure fact: even though this is a day of messy, grueling labor, for the women of Jen, it's also a fashion show. You might think, why wear your best clothes to a mud plastering event? But in local culture, the crepusage is one of the biggest social events of the year. The women compete to wear the most vibrant fabrics, the most intricate gold jewelry, and the most elaborate hairstyles. It's a display of family wealth and personal grace. They manage to walk through a literal construction site, surrounded by flying mud and sweaty men, without getting a single drop of slime on their brightly colored pain wraps. It's a level of poise that you, currently looking like a drowned mud rat, can only dream of achieving. You follow the line back toward the river for a bit, curious to see the source. The bank of the Bani is a beehive of activity. Hundreds of women are wading into the shallows, filling their vessels, and chatting. This is the social media of 14th century Mali. This is where news is exchanged, marriages are discussed, and jokes are cracked. You realize that while the men are busy with the spectacle of climbing the walls, the women are the ones maintaining the social fabric of the city. However, this gendered division of labor is at the heart of a persistent academic controversy. If you look at the field of gender archaeology or feminist historiography, you'll find scholars who are deeply divided over the crepusage. One camp of historians argues that the festival is a patriarchal structure that excludes women from the sacred act of touching the mosque itself. They point out that women are traditionally forbidden from climbing the scaffolding or applying the plaster to the walls of the sanctuary. They see it as a symbolic marginalization. Women provide the raw materials, the water, but men perform the divine work. On the other side of the debate, many Malian scholars and anthropologists argue that this is a classic case of Westerners projecting their own values onto an African context. They contend that the role of the water-bearer is not a subordinate one, but a position of immense spiritual power. In many Sahelian traditions, water is the ultimate purifying element. By bringing the water, the women are giving birth to the mud. Without their contribution, the mud is dead and cannot protect the house of God. They argue that the roles aren't superior and inferior, but complementary. In the eyes of the community, a man climbing a minaret without a woman bringing him water is just a guy playing in the dirt. Both are required for the miracle to happen. You walk back toward the mosque, following a young woman who is carrying a bucket in each hand and one on her head. The sheer physical strength required for this is staggering. A gallon of water weighs about 8 pounds. These women are carrying 4 or 5 gallons at a time, over uneven, sandy terrain, in 110-degree heat, dozens of times a day. You try to imagine doing just one trip, and your neck starts to ache in sympathy. As they reach the plaza, the interaction between the men in the pits and the women with the water is like a choreographed dance. A man will shout, "Water," and a woman will glide over, pouring the liquid exactly where his shovel is turning the clay. There's no wasted movement. There's a lot of teasing, too, shouted compliments, laughter, and the occasional playful splash. The water brigade brings a sense of joy and refinement to what could otherwise be a very grim, dirty job. You notice that as the day peaks, the women also start bringing more than just water for the mud. They bring large pots of ginger juice, hibiscus tea, called bisap, and snacks for the workers. They are the logistics department, the catering crew, and the quality control team all rolled into one. You see an elder woman standing near a pit, nodding in approval as a fresh batch of mud is mixed. She's not touching the dirt, but her presence is felt. She's making sure that tradition is being followed correctly. The sun is at its absolute zenith now. The shadows have disappeared, and the heat is radiating off the mosque walls in visible waves. You take a sip of some ginger juice offered by one of the girls, and the spicy kick nearly knocks you over, but it's exactly what you need. You look at the line of women, still moving, still graceful, still colorful. They are the lubricant that keeps the machine of Jen running. As the water brigade continues its endless loop to the river and back, you realize that the story of the mosque is a story of balance. It's the balance between the hot sun and the cool water, between the heavy clay and the light straw, and between the frantic energy of the men and the steady, enduring grace of the women. You watch a bucket of water disappear into a mud pit, and as the mix turns into that perfect, creamy consistency, you prepare yourself for what comes next. The master masons are calling for more material. The walls are ready. The stage is set. And it's time to see the people who actually hold the forbidden knowledge of the mud. You're standing near the base of the central minaret, and you realize that even in this absolute chaos of splashing mud and shouting teenagers, there is a small circle of calm. In the center of that calm is a man who looks less like a construction worker and more like a high priest. He is one of the Baritan, the master masons of Jen. He's wearing a simple, mud-flecked robe, and while everyone else is sprinting, he is moving with a slow, deliberate gravity. He isn't carrying a basket. He doesn't have a shovel. All he has is a small wooden tool that looks like a flattened spoon, and his hands that look like they've been sculpted out of the very earth he works with. In our world, if you want to build a house, you need a blueprint, a structural engineer, a city permit, and probably a very long contract. In Jen, you just need a member of the Baritan. The mainstream historical fact you should know is that this is a hereditary guild, a closed society that has been the architectural brain of the city for over 7 centuries. You don't just apply to be a mason here. You are born into it. The secrets of how to balance a 60-foot mud tower, how to mix the perfect plaster, and how to read the mood of the river clay are passed down from father to son like a sacred, muddy inheritance. You watch as the master mason approaches a section of the wall that's just been slapped with a fresh layer of plaster. He doesn't just look at it, he feels it. He presses his palm against the wet surface, closing his eyes for a second as if he's listening to the building's heartbeat. And here is where things get a little supernatural, or at least deeply mysterious. It is a well-documented, yet still quirky, fact that the Bariton are believed to possess mystical protection or niyama. Before the first basket of mud is ever applied to the walls, the master masons perform secret rituals. They don't just use rice husks and baobab powder, they are known to embed small protective amulets, or gree-gree, into the core of the walls. Some say they whisper specific incantations into the mud to ensure it won't crack under the Saharan sun. There are even whispers, though you didn't hear it from me, that the exact spots where these amulets are buried are the true anchors of the building, and that without them, the physical mud would have no soul to hold it together. To the people of Jen, the mosque isn't just a feat of engineering, it's a feat of spiritual diplomacy. The mason looks at you, noticing your wide-eyed stare. He gestures for you to come closer. He takes a handful of the fresh, wet plaster and shows you how to smooth it. It looks easy when he does it, a gentle, sweeping motion that turns a lumpy mess into a surface as smooth as glass. You try it, and you immediately realize you have the grace of a caffeinated elephant. Your mud is lumpy, it's dripping, and it's mostly ending up on your elbows. He laughs, a low, gravelly sound, and moves your hand, guiding you in a rhythmic arc swoosh. Swoosh. For a second, you feel it, the moment the mud grabs the wall. This brings us to a massive academic controversy that has been rattling the cages of West African history for years, the Master Mason versus the French architect debate. I've touched on this before, but it goes deeper. When the mosque was rebuilt in 1907, the French colonial government claimed that their engineers provided the technical expertise to ensure the building wouldn't collapse like the previous ones had. However, local oral historians and modern scholars like Jean-Louis Bourgeois have argued that the French basically just sat in the shade and watched. The controversy lies in the standardization. Some historians argue that the French forced the masons to follow a rigid, symmetrical plan that was foreign to the organic, imperfect beauty of traditional Sahelian design. They see the 1907 mosque as a colonial reinterpretation of Africa. But others, and this is the side the Bariton usually lean toward, argue that the masons secretly sabotaged the French plans, building it the way they wanted to anyway. They claim that the mosque's French elements are just a superficial skin over a deeply African soul. It's a battle over who gets to claim the intellectual property of one of the world's most famous buildings. Was it a colonial project, or a grand act of architectural resistance? The mason next to you doesn't care about French architects or academic papers. He cares about the lean. He points to a section of the wall where the Toran beams are slightly misaligned. He barks an order, and 3 young men immediately scramble up the scaffolding to adjust the weight of the plaster. He is like a conductor leading a silent orchestra of mud. He knows that if one side dries too fast, the tension will pull the wall outward. He's calculating evaporation rates and structural load-bearing in his head, without a single calculator in sight. You realize that these masons are the only reason the city of Jen still looks the way it does. In other parts of Mali, traditional mud architecture is being replaced by modern, concrete blocks and corrugated tin roofs because they are easier to maintain. But the Bariton of Jen have a stranglehold on the city's identity. They have convinced the population that to live in a mud house is to be a real person of Jen. They aren't just builders, they are the guardians of a lifestyle. As you continue to help, which mostly means staying out of the way of people who actually know what they're doing, you notice the sun is starting its slow, brutal crawl toward the afternoon. The master mason takes a break, sitting on a small wooden stool in the shade. He pulls out a small radio, and through the static, you hear the sounds of Malian blues. He looks at the mosque, then at the mud-covered crowd, and he nods, satisfied. The earth is a jealous thing, he seems to say with that nod. If you don't give it your sweat, it won't give you its shade. You look at your hands, now caked in a dry, gray crust that feels like a second skin. You feel a strange sense of pride. You've been taught by a man whose family has been doing this since the Crusades were still a current event. You haven't just learned how to plaster a wall, you've caught a glimpse of the forbidden knowledge, the secret that a building isn't just something you live in, it's something you have to talk to, pray over, and occasionally, bury a lucky charm inside. The master mason stands up, his break over. He taps you on the shoulder and points toward the northern wall, which is still looking a bit bare. The work isn't done yet, and the Grand Conductor has more movements to lead. You pick up a fresh basket of that smelly, fermented mud, and as you head back into the fray, you realize that while you might be a terrible mason, you're finally starting to understand the language of the earth. You're leaning against one of the massive exterior buttresses now, watching the wet plaster you just applied start to lose its sheen as the desert air greedily gulps up its moisture. Your arms are heavy, your back is humming with a dull ache, and honestly, you're probably wondering, why? Why did they do this? Why, in a world where humans have figured out how to make steel beams that touch the clouds and glass that never fogs, did the people of Gen double down on dirt? You look around at the city, a sprawling, organic masterpiece of earth, and it hits you, this isn't a lack of progress. It's a masterclass in survival. Let's dive into the mainstream historical logic here. This building is the pinnacle of the Sudano-Sahelian architectural style. It's a mouthful to say, but it essentially means architecture of the shore. Not the ocean shore, but the shore of the Sahara. For nearly 1,000 years, architects from Ghana to Mali to Nigeria realized that in a place where the sun is trying to kill you for 12 hours a day, stone is a terrible idea. Stone holds onto heat and radiates it back like a griddle. Concrete is even worse, it turns houses into ovens. But mud? Mud is a miracle. Here is the obscure, slightly science-nerdy fact that makes this mosque a piece of genius technology: mud is a high-performance thermal battery. Those walls you've been sweating over are nearly 3 feet thick. During the day, as the sun hammers down at 115 degrees, the mud absorbs that heat. But because the walls are so dense, the heat takes a very long time to travel through to the inside. By the time the heat finally reaches the interior, the sun has already set, the air has cooled down, and the mosque starts to release that stored warmth, keeping the worshippers comfortable during the chilly Saharan nights. It's a natural, zero electricity, perfectly timed air conditioning system that has been running without a single software update since the 13th century. You walk over to one of the large, heavy wooden doors and step just a few inches inside the threshold. The transition is startling. It's like walking into a different climate zone. Outside, the world is a glaring, golden furnace. Inside, it's dim, silent, and at least 20 degrees cooler. You can feel the coolness radiating off the pillars, those 90 massive rectangular, forest, columns I mentioned earlier. They aren't just holding up the roof, they are giant blocks of thermal mass, keeping the air chilled. It's so quiet in there that you can hear your own heart beating, a sharp contrast to the shouting and drumming happening just 10 feet behind you. But this brings us to a spicy academic controversy that has been fueling late-night debates at architecture conventions for decades: the struggle for the future of mud. On one side, you have the modernizers, often backed by international development agencies, who argue that mud architecture is a symbol of poverty and underdevelopment. They push for durable materials like concrete and corrugated iron, claiming that the annual labor of the crepusage is an unfair burden on a modernizing society. They see the mosque as a beautiful relic, but not a viable model for the 21st century. On the other side, you have the eco-traditionalists and a new wave of sustainable architects. They argue that the Western obsession with concrete is a global environmental disaster. They point to the Great Mosque as the gold standard of green building. They argue that mud is 100% recyclable, has a zero carbon footprint, and provides better insulation than almost any modern material. These scholars claim that the burden of the crepusage is actually the secret sauce of social cohesion, and that the world should be moving toward Gen S model, not away from it. Is mud a backwards material, or is it the high-tech future of a warming planet? Depending on which academic you ask, the Great Mosque is either a dying monument or a blueprint for the survival of the human race. You step back out into the light, and the heat hits you like a physical wall. You look at the mosque's surface again. It's not just a flat wall, it's covered in those rhythmic, vertical ridges, the buttresses. These aren't just for style, either. They provide shade to the wall itself. As the sun moves across the sky, these ridges cast long shadows over the recesses, ensuring that at any given time, a large portion of the building's skin is in the shade. It's a building that literally protects itself from the sun. You reach out and touch a section of the wall that has already dried. It feels different now, less like pudding and more like velvet-coated stone. You realize that the imperfection of the mud is actually its strength. Concrete is rigid. When the earth shifts or the temperature swings, it cracks and stays cracked. Mud is flexible. It's alive. It expands and contracts. It can be patched with a handful of dirt and a splash of water. It's a self-healing building. If a modern skyscraper gets a crack in its foundation, you need a multi-million-dollar engineering team. If the Great Mosque gets a crack, you just need a bucket and a neighbor. Think about the sheer arrogance of our modern buildings for a second. We build things out of glass in the desert and then spend millions of dollars on massive humming machines to keep the inside from becoming a greenhouse. Here, they just listen to the earth. They use the river and the sun to fight the sun. There's a quiet humility in that, but also a staggering amount of intellectual power. You notice a group of architecture students from the capital, Bamako, standing nearby. They are sketching the arches, measuring the thickness of the walls, and arguing about load-bearing ratios. It's a reminder that this isn't just a traditional event, it's a living laboratory. The Bariton masons are watching them with an amused, slightly skeptical look. They don't need sketches or load-bearing ratios. They have the muscle memory of 700 years. They know the mud in a way that a computer model never will. The sun is starting to tilt now, beginning its long, dramatic descent. The shadows of the Toran beams are lengthening, stretching across the plaza like the fingers of a giant. You look at your own hands, which are now stained a deep, earthy red-brown. You aren't just a visitor anymore, you are a participant in a grand architectural experiment. You are helping to maintain a thermal battery, a cultural anchor, and a potential solution to a global crisis, all at the same time. You pick up your basket. It feels lighter now, or maybe you're just getting stronger. You head back toward the northern face, where the sun is still biting. You have a few more hours of work before the plastering part of this story concludes. As you walk, you think about those thick, cool walls and the forest of pillars inside. You realize that the mosque isn't just a house of prayer, it's a fortress built of dust, standing defiantly against the heat, proving that sometimes, the most primitive solutions are the most sophisticated ones we have. You wipe a streak of wet mud from your jaw, and as you look at the sunset catching the golden dust in the air, you can't help but feel a bit of historical vertigo. You're standing in front of a building made of dirt, but 700 years ago, this very spot was one of the wealthiest nodes on the entire planet. It's a strange paradox, isn't it? We usually associate empire and unimaginable wealth with marble columns, gilded domes, and ivory gates. But in the 14th century Mali Empire, the ultimate flex wasn't how much stone you could haul, it was how much gold you could move while living in a house of mud. Let's talk about the man who probably would have found your traveler's exhaustion quite amusing, Mansa Musa. You've likely heard his name in a Top 10 Richest People in History video. We're talking about a guy so wealthy that his personal fortune is literally impossible to calculate by modern standards. The mainstream historical fact is that in 1324, Mansa Musa went on a pilgrimage to Mecca that was so extravagant it actually broke the economy of the Mediterranean. He traveled with a caravan of 60,000 men and dozens of camels, each carrying hundreds of pounds of pure gold dust. He handed out so much gold in Cairo that the price of the metal plummeted, and it took the Egyptian economy over a decade to recover from his generosity. You look at the mosque and try to reconcile that image, a man who could buy and sell entire kingdoms, with this structure made of river silt and straw. Why didn't he build a Taj Mahal? Why didn't he import marble from Italy or limestone from Egypt? The answer lies in the sheer, understated power of the Mali Empire. They didn't need to mimic anyone else. Jen, along with its sister city Timbuktu, was the center of a trade network that made the Silk Road look like a neighborhood sidewalk. This was where the gold from the secret mines of Bambuk and Beret met the salt slabs from the Sahara. Here is a quirky, slightly obscure fact for you. In the markets of Jen back then, salt was often traded ounce for ounce with gold. Think about that the next time you shake a bit of salt onto your fries. To the people of the desert, gold was just a pretty metal, but salt was life. It preserved food, it balanced the body's electrolytes in the heat, and it was the ultimate currency. Jen was the warehouse of the world. The mosque you're leaning against was built in a city where even the most common merchant likely had more gold in his storeroom than a European king had in his treasury. As you watch the shadows of the minarets stretch across the plaza, you're looking at the ghost of a global superpower. But this leads us into one of the most persistent and heated academic controversies in African history, the legend of the Andalusian architect. The story goes that after Mansa Musa returned from Mecca, he brought back a brilliant poet and architect from Granada named Abu Ishaq al-Sahili. According to traditional history books, al-Sahili was the genius who invented the Sudano-Sahelian style, introducing the use of fired bricks and the pyramidal minarets we see today. For a long time, Western scholars loved this story because it allowed them to credit civilized, Mediterranean influence for the architectural wonders of Africa. However, many modern historians and African archaeologists are calling foul on this narrative. They argue that this is a classic piece of Eurocentric mythmaking. They point to archaeological evidence showing that Gengeno, the Old Gen, located just a couple of miles away, had sophisticated urban structures and unique mud-building techniques long before al-Sahili ever stepped foot in Mali. The debate is fierce. Was al-Sahili a revolutionary designer who changed African architecture forever, or was he just a wealthy traveler who took credit for a local tradition that had already been perfecting itself for 500 years? If you ask the master masons of the Baritan, they'll tell you that their ancestors didn't need a poet from Spain to teach them how to talk to the mud. You pick up a stray piece of dried mud and crumble it between your fingers. It's strange to think that this dust is the only thing left of an empire that once controlled nearly half of the world's gold supply. The gold is gone, melted down, minted into coins, lost in the vaults of Europe and Asia. But the mud? The mud is still here. There's a profound lesson in that, isn't there? Permanence is an illusion. Mansa Musa's gold caused inflation and chaos, but his investment in the mud created a culture that has survived the rise and fall of dozens of subsequent regimes. The sun is lower now, and the air is turning a hazy, romantic orange. You imagine the 14th century version of this plaza, filled with Tuareg traders in indigo robes, scholars from Baghdad carrying priceless manuscripts, and the smell of roasting lamb and exotic spices. You realize that Jen wasn't an isolated, desert outpost. It was the cosmopolitan heart of the world. People came here to get rich, yes, but they also came here to learn. The mosque was the university, the library, and the courthouse all in one. You look at your mud-caked boots. They don't look so ridiculous anymore. They look like they belong in a place where the earth is the most valuable thing people own. The Mali Empire didn't leave behind giant stone pyramids or crumbling colosseums. They left behind a living building that requires the people to touch it every year. They created a monument that demands memory. If you stop caring about it, it disappears. It's the ultimate form of historical accountability. A young boy runs past you, carrying a small piece of wood he's using as a toy boat in the mud overflow from a nearby pit. He has no idea he's playing in the ruins of the wealthiest empire in human history. To him, it's just home. And maybe that's the real gold Mansa Musa left behind, not the metal that broke the Egyptian economy, but the sense that a community could build something magnificent out of the very ground they stand on. The drums are starting to slow down as the day's labor nears its end. The sky is a deep, bruised crimson now. You feel the weight of the centuries pressing down on you, but it's not a heavy weight, it's more like a warm blanket. You're standing on the bones of a lost empire, but as long as the mud is wet and the people are singing, nothing is actually lost. You take a deep breath, smelling the river and the fermenting straw, and prepare for the final few hours of the festival. The empire may be a ghost, but the mosque is very much alive. The sun is almost tucked behind the horizon now, and the sky has transitioned into a deep, electric indigo. You're standing there, looking at your mud-caked hands, and you see a guy walk past you. He's got a high-end smartphone in one hand and a dripping mud basket in the other. He takes a quick selfie, flashes a grin, and then gets back to the relay. It's a jarring reminder that we aren't actually in the 13th century. This is the 21st century crashing into the ancient world, and as you look at the Great Mosque, you realize it's currently caught in a very high-stakes tug-of-war between being a living sanctuary and a global museum piece. Welcome to the complicated world of heritage status. The mainstream historical fact you should know is that in 1988, UNESCO officially designated the Great Mosque and the Old City of Jen as a World Heritage Site. On paper, this was a massive win. It brought international recognition, tourism dollars, and a certain level of protection from the kind of modernization that usually involves bulldozers and cheap concrete. But in reality, being labeled a World Heritage Site is a bit like being forced to live in a glass display case while everyone watches you try to eat your lunch. UNESCO has very strict rules. They want things to stay authentic. They want the building to look exactly as it did when it was discovered by the global community. But here's the problem: mud architecture is the opposite of static. It is a living, breathing, evolving thing. Every time you slap a new layer of plaster on that wall, the building changes. Over a century of crepusage, the walls actually get thicker. The sharp edges of the pillars soften and round out. The building grows, like a tree adding rings. This leads us to a massive academic fistfight that has been brewing in the journals of heritage studies for years. On one side, you have the static preservationists. They argue that if the building's shape changes too much, it loses its universal outstanding value. They want to freeze the mosque in time. On the other side, you have the dynamic heritage scholars. They argue that the process of the festival is more important than the geometry of the walls. They ask a very pointed question: if you stop the building from changing, aren't you actually killing the culture that built it? It's basically the ship of Theseus paradox, but instead of wooden planks, we're talking about fermented river silt. If you replace every handful of mud over 50 years, is it still the same 1907 mosque? Or is it a 2026 version of an ancient dream? You lean back against the cool plinth, feeling the vibration of the city. There's a reason you're likely standing outside on this platform rather than wandering the interior halls right now, and it's not just because you're covered in mud. This brings us to a weird, slightly scandalous fact that most tourists find out the hard way. Since 1996, non-Muslims have been strictly forbidden from entering the interior of the Great Mosque. Why? Well, it wasn't always this way. For decades, curious travelers would wander in to see the Forest of Pillars. But in 1996, a French fashion magazine, rumored to be Vogue, though accounts vary, managed to get permission for a photo shoot inside the sanctuary. Depending on who you ask, the models were either wearing inappropriate clothing or were posing in ways that the local community found deeply disrespectful to the sacred space. Shortly after that, a music video was filmed there that caused an even bigger uproar. The backlash was swift and permanent. The imam and the local council of elders close the doors to outsiders, turning the interior into a private, sacred space once again. It's a rare example of a world-famous landmark essentially saying, you can look at the outside, but the inside belongs to us. Honestly, in an age where every square inch of the planet is being Instagrammed to death, there's something kind of refreshing about a building that keeps its secrets. You watch as a group of European conservationists in beige vests talk animatedly with a master mason. They're pointing at a section of the wall where the mud looks a bit uneven. The mason is nodding politely, but you can tell he's thinking about his dinner. This is the heritage conflict, in a nutshell. To the experts from Paris or New York, this is a fragile miracle that needs to be managed. To the man with the mud-stained hands, this is just his Friday. There's a real tension here. Because the mosque is so fragile, there's a constant fear that a particularly heavy rainy season could do permanent damage. In recent years, climate change has made the Sahelian weather patterns more unpredictable. The rains come less often, but when they do, they are more violent. You might think, well, just use better sealant. But as we discussed earlier, if you seal the mud, it can't breathe, and it melts from the inside. The mosque is caught in a beautiful, terrifying trap. It can only survive if it remains vulnerable. As you look around, you see the cracks in the heritage dream. You see plastic water bottles scattered near the ancient mud pits. You see a kid wearing a Real Madrid jersey helping a mason who is wearing a traditional hand-woven robe. The city is trying to be a 21st century town while living in a 13th century skin. It's not easy. Tourism has fluctuated wildly due to regional instability, and the protection promised by international bodies often feels like a lot of paperwork with very little actual mud. You realize that the real miracle isn't the building itself, it's the fact that the people haven't given up on it. In a world of concrete and glass, it would be so much easier for the people of Jen to just let the mosque melt and build something sensible. But they don't. They continue this grueling, smelly, beautiful tradition not because UNESCO told them to, but because without the mosque, they wouldn't know who they are. The air is cooling down rapidly now, and the first stars are beginning to poke through the hazy sky. The frantic energy of the afternoon is shifting into something more celebratory. The work is almost done. You look at the towers of the mosque, which now look dark and imposing against the twilight. They look like they've survived empires, colonialists, fashion photographers, and academic debates, and they've come out the other side still standing. You stand up, brushing some dried mud off your pants, an exercise in futility, really, and prepare for the final act. The plastering is nearly finished, and the party is about to begin. You've survived the heat, the smell, and the history lessons. Now, you just have to survive the celebration. You take one last look at the fragile miracle, and realize that as long as the people of Jen keep their smartphones in one hand and their mud baskets in the other, this sandcastle is going to be just fine. The sun has finally surrendered, dipping below the horizon and leaving a sky that looks like it's been painted with crushed amethysts and gold leaf. You're standing in the center of the great plaza, and for the first time in nearly 12 hours, the air isn't filled with the sound of flying mud. The frantic sprinting has stopped. The shouting has faded into a low, communal murmur. You look at the great mosque, and it's like seeing a completely different building. Gone are the scars, the water-carved grooves, and the crumbly, sun-bleached patches. Instead, the mosque is glowing. The fresh plaster is still wet, making the entire structure look like it's been dipped in dark, creamy caramel. It's smooth, it's sleek, and in this twilight, it looks like it's pulsating with life. You're exhausted, the kind of deep muscle fatigue that makes your bones feel like they've turned into lead. Your skin is tight where the mud has dried, and you've probably forgotten what it feels like to have clean fingernails. But as you look around, you see the same exhaustion on every face, and yet, everyone is smiling. This is the moment of the grand reveal. The mainstream historical fact you should know about this stage is the role of the baryton in the final inspection. Even though the sun is down, the master masons are still circling the building. They walk with lanterns, checking the thickness of the plaster on the corners and ensuring the Toran beams are clear of excess debris. It's only when the head of the Masons Guild gives a nod of approval to the imam that the festival is officially considered a success. It's a moment of immense civic relief. If the Masons aren't happy, the city isn't happy. You find a spot to sit on the edge of the plinth, dangling your muddy legs. Someone hands you a bowl of hot rice topped with a rich, spicy mutton sauce, the traditional, thank you, meal provided by the community for the workers. It's the best thing you've ever tasted. As you eat, you look up at the three great minarets. They look so tall against the stars, and those ostrich eggs at the very top are gleaming white. Here is a weird, slightly eccentric fact for you. Have you ever wondered how those eggs stay so clean? During the crepusage, mud is flying everywhere. Thousands of people are slapping wet clay onto the walls, and the minarets get the worst of it. But those ostrich eggs, symbols of purity and fertility, must remain pristine. There is a specific, very brave group of young men whose final job of the day is to climb to the very tip of the spires with a damp cloth to wipe away any stray mud from the eggs. Sometimes, they even replace old, cracked eggs with fresh ones donated by local farmers. It's the highest, most precarious housekeeping job in the world, performed 60 feet up in the dark, just to make sure the crown of the mosque remains perfect. But, as with everything in Jen, even the beautiful new skin of the mosque is a subject of academic debate. If you look at old photographs from 1907 or even the 1950s, the mosque looks a bit more angular. Today, it looks softer, rounder, almost more organic. This has sparked a lively argument among architectural historians about what they call aesthetic fattening. One group of scholars argues that the annual plastering is slowly distorting the original design. They claim that because the people add a new layer every year but almost never scrape away the old layers, the building is essentially getting fatter. They worry that in another century, the fine details of the buttresses and the sharp points of the minarets will be swallowed up by a mountain of mud. On the other side, local historians argue that this thickening is a natural, beautiful evolution. They see the building not as a static blueprint, but as a living creature that grows its own protective fat to survive the harsh Saharan environment. They argue that the roundness is the soul of Jen, a rejection of the sharp, cold lines of Western architecture. So, is it a distorted relic or a growing masterpiece? While the professors argue in their journals, the people of Jen just keep adding the mud. You finish your meal, feeling the warmth of the spice spreading through your chest. The plaza is now filled with small groups of people sitting on mats, sharing stories and laughing about the day's mishaps. You hear a story about a guy who fell into a mud pit headfirst, and another about a neighborhood team that almost stole the mud from a rival pit. This is the social glue of the city. For one day, the social hierarchies, the wealth, the status, the age, are all blurred under a thick layer of common mud. You look at your own hands. The dry mud is starting to flake off, falling onto the dust of the plaza. You realize that you've just participated in a ritual that is as much about the people as it is about the building. The mosque is just the excuse, the real work was the unity. In our world, we pay taxes and hope the city council fixes the potholes. Here, you put your hands in the dirt and you fix the sanctuary yourself. There's a power in that, a sense of ownership that we've lost in our convenient modern lives. The air is getting cooler, and a soft breeze is blowing in from the Bonny River. It carries the scent of water and wet earth, a refreshing change from the sour fermentation of the afternoon. You feel a deep, satisfying, good, tired. You've earned your place in this city, at least for tonight. You look up at the mosque one last time. It looks solid, ancient, and yet brand new. It's a paradox made of earth. It's the largest mud building in the world, but it's also just a big, fragile sandcastle that will start eroding again the next time it rains. But that's a problem for next year. Tonight, the mosque is perfect. The ostrich eggs are clean, the walls are smooth, and the spirit of the city is renewed. You stand up, your joints creaking like an old wooden door, and start the slow walk back to your guesthouse. The drums have finally gone silent, replaced by the soft chatter of families and the occasional bark of a dog in the distance. The great plastering is over. You've touched the history of Mali, and more importantly, it has definitely touched you, mostly on your clothes, your hair, and behind your ears. As you walk through the winding, dark alleys of Jen, you feel like you're walking through a dream. The mud houses around you seem to hum with a quiet energy. You're ready for sleep, the kind of sleep that only comes after a day of honest, dirty, communal labor. But before you close your eyes, you know there's one final chapter to this journey. The physical work is done, but the spiritual closing is still to come. Tomorrow, the mosque will host its first prayers in its new skin, and you'll see the building not as a construction site, but as a sanctuary. But that's for tomorrow. For now, you just want to find a bucket of water and a very large towel. You take a deep breath of the night air, feeling the Saharan dust settle one last time, and smile. You survived the mud dash. You climbed the quills of the porcupine. You were a link in the chain. And as you reach your doorstep, you realize that while you came here to see a building, what you actually found was a heartbeat. You wake up the next morning, and for a split second, you don't know where you are. Your shoulders feel like they've been replaced by heavy bags of sand, and your hands are so stiff you can barely curl them into a fist. Then, the smell hits you, that faint, lingering, earthy scent of river silt and fermented straw. You look at your bedside table and see a small pile of dried gray flakes that must have fallen off your hair during the night. It's a souvenir from the Great Mosque, a tiny piece of history that decided to come home with you. You pull yourself out of bed and walk to the window. The city of Jen is quiet, a heavy, contented silence. The frantic energy of yesterday has evaporated, replaced by a sense of profound renewal. You look toward the plaza, and there it is. The Great Mosque of Jen. In the soft, golden light of the morning, it looks absolutely ethereal. The wet mud has begun to dry into a uniform, velvety ochre. The shadows in the recessed arches are deep and cool, and the ostrich eggs on the minarets are gleaming like pearls against the pale blue sky. It's no longer a construction site. It's a sanctuary again. The mainstream historical fact you should carry with you is that this building is more than just a feat of architecture, it is the spiritual anchor for the entire Niger inland delta. For centuries, Jen has been a center of the Maliki school of Islamic jurisprudence, known for its emphasis on community consensus and traditional practices. The mosque isn't just a place to pray, it's where the community's moral and social guidelines are reinforced. The annual plastering is the physical manifestation of that consensus. It's the one day a year where everyone, regardless of their wealth or status, literally puts their hands on the same wall to support the same goal. In a region that has seen empires rise and fall, and colonial powers come and go, this building has remained the one constant, North Star. As you walk toward the plaza for one last look, you notice something curious. A group of older men are gathering some of the dried mud that fell off the walls during the frenzy of yesterday. This leads us to a weirdly poetic, slightly obscure fact: in Jen, mud is never truly waste. When a mud building, even a house, eventually collapses or is demolished, the material isn't carted away to a landfill. It's recycled. The old mud, which has been blessed by years of human habitation and prayer, is mixed back into the new mud. There is a local belief that the earth has a memory. By using the old soil to build the new walls, you are quite literally incorporating the spirits of the ancestors into the current structure. The mosque you see today contains molecular traces of the mosque built by Sultan Kanburu in the 1200s. It is a building that never truly dies, it just changes its shape. You stand at the edge of the plinth, watching the first few worshippers arrive for the morning prayer. They are dressed in pristine white robes, a sharp contrast to the mud-slicked chaos of yesterday. This transition from messy labor to sacred purity is a key part of the city's rhythm. But even here, there is a simmering academic controversy that modern historians love to poke at: the modernization of the sacred space. For years, there has been a debate about whether the Great Mosque should be fitted with modern amenities, specifically electricity, ceiling fans, and indoor plumbing. Some scholars and international conservationists argue that adding wires and pipes would compromise the structural integrity of the mud walls and ruin the authentic experience of the building. They want it to remain a pure example of 13th-century living. However, many local worshippers and some progressive historians argue that this is a form of architectural Orientalism. They ask why the people of Jen should have to sweat in 115-degree heat just to satisfy a Western tourist's desire for authenticity. They argue that a living mosque must serve its people, and if that means solar-powered fans and LED lights, then the mud should be able to accommodate them. As you look at a small solar panel perched discreetly on a nearby rooftop, you realize that the struggle between the past and the present is being negotiated every single day in these narrow streets. You take a seat on a stone bench, watching the city wake up. The women are heading back to the river with their buckets, but today they are walking slowly, their colorful wraps bright against the dusty ground. The children are back in the alleys, but instead of diving into mud pits, they are playing games with pebbles and sticks. The great plastering has become a memory, a story to be told and retold until next year. You look at your own hands again. The skin is a little raw from the grit, but the dirt is mostly gone. However, you know that a part of you is still there, on that wall. A few of your skin cells, a bit of your sweat, and a lot of your effort are now dried into the southern face of the great minaret. You are officially part of the memory of the mud. There's a profound sense of peace that comes with that realization. In our modern world, we are so obsessed with leaving a permanent mark, writing books, building stone monuments, or leaving digital footprints. But here, they've learned the secret of the desert: nothing is permanent except the cycle itself. The rain will come, the mud will wash away, and the people will return to fix it. It's a beautiful, endless conversation between humanity and the earth. You stand up, ready to begin your journey back to the world of concrete and glass. But as you turn to leave, you take one last look at those three towering minarets. They don't look like history anymore. They look like old friends. You've touched their skin, you've smelled their breath, and you've helped them stand tall for another year. You realize that the Great Mosque of Jen isn't just a UNESCO site or a textbook chapter. It's a promise that as long as people are willing to get their hands dirty for something they believe in, the world can be rebuilt, one handful of mud at a time. You walk away, the sound of the morning call to prayer beginning to echo through the streets. It's a low, melodic sound that seems to vibrate through the very walls of the city. You feel lighter, despite the ache in your muscles. You've seen the soul of Mali, and it's made of river water, rice husks, and an unbreakable community spirit. The journey is over, but as you reach the edge of the city, you know that the mud will never quite leave you. Now, let the world outside your window begin to fade away. The journey through the sun-drenched streets of Jen is over, and the heat of the Saharan sun is replaced by the cool, gentle stillness of your own room. Imagine the rhythm of the mud dash slowing down, the drums softening into a faint, rhythmic heartbeat that matches your own steady breathing. The colors of the sunset, the violets, the deep oranges, and the ochre of the mosque, are blending together into a soft, velvety dark. You are no longer standing in the dust. You are lying back, feeling the weight of the day lift from your shoulders, just like the coolness that settles into the thick mud walls of the sanctuary at night. The scent of the river and the dry grass is just a memory now, drifting away like a light breeze. Your hands are resting, your mind is quiet, and the long, winding stories of sultans and masons are folding themselves up like ancient manuscripts, tucking themselves away into the corners of your mind. The great mosque stands silent under the desert stars, its new skin drying in the moonlight, safe and sound for another year. And just like that building, you are safe, you are grounded, and you are part of a story that never truly ends. The earth is still, the air is soft, and the journey is complete. You are drifting now, floating on a river of quiet thoughts, moving slowly toward the edge of a deep, peaceful sleep. The shadows are long, the lights are dim, and the world is at rest, everything is still. Sleep well, the story ends here. Good night.